This dress has traveled farther than most Palestinians ever will. It has crossed borders, passed through checkpoints, custom clearances, and museum archives. It has been photographed, catalogued, and displayed under white light. It carries the scent of cedar chests and desert dust. It carries the weight of absence. When its maker was displaced, the dress stayed behind. When her village was erased, the dress survived. And when her descendants were denied the right to return, the dress continued to move freely, beautifully, and without permission. The movement tells the story I want to share today. The story of Tatreez, Palestinian embroidery, a living art that has become a nomad of its own kind. While Palestinians remain confined by walls, by occupation, by exile, these embroidered dresses have journeyed across continents. They now speak in global museums, in diaspora homes, and in art exhibitions, carrying voice, carrying memory, carrying presence, where bodies cannot travel. The title of this session, Homo Viator, means the humanist traveler. It comes from philosophy, from theology, where it describes life itself as a journey, a continual passage, spiritual, a quest towards meaning, towards becoming who we ultimately are, and the legacy that we leave behind. In this paper, I argue that Tatreez has become the traveler, the Homo Viator of a displaced people. But for Palestinians, movement is never simple. It is a story of borders, checkpoints, and the denial of return. So in my reading, Homo Viator takes on another form. I examine how when people cannot move freely, their objects do. I found out how these embroidered dresses, or thobes as they're called in Arabic, become the travelers. They carry memory, they carry voice, and they carry belonging across borders that their makers cannot cross. The theme of Homo Viator asks us to think about clothing as a companion in motion, the dress that walks beside us, that records where we have been. But in Palestine, movement carries a very different weight. In Palestine, movement is journey, it's transformation, it's testimony. For centuries before 1948, the Bedouin moved freely across the Naqab and the plains in Palestine, following seasons, following water, following their herds. Their nomadism was a rhythm of life. It was a conversation with the land. By contrast, Palestinians today move under restrictions through occupation, exile, and the denial of return. For them, movement is not chosen. Movement is imposed. And yet, one part of their world still moves freely, Tatreez, the embroidery that travels in the place of its makers. It journeys from village to camp, from market to museum, from body to mannequin, from Palestine to diaspora. Each stitch carries not only beauty, but a story of survival and continuity, a story that persists. How do embroidered garments act as nomads of memory, crossing borders when their makers cannot? All Palestinians are restricted by fences or checkpoints or permits or refugee camps and are denied return to their lands and their homes. And this paper asks, what happens when the dress becomes the traveler and the people remain confined? Through heritage, post-colonial, and feminist lenses, I explore how these moving textiles embody an ethical form of mobility, one that remembers, resists, and reclaims presence in a world that has tried to render Palestinians invisible. Before the Nakba, the Naqab Bedouins embodied an ethics of mobility. Their movement was reciprocal. It was shaped by rainfall, by trade, by kinship, what I call a moral geography of motion. But colonial frameworks redefined that movement as disorder. Under Ottoman, British, and later Israeli rule, freedom of motion became increasingly criminalized. After 1948, entire tribes were expelled or confined to concentration townships. The archetype of the free nomad became the figure of the immobilized subject. This is where my story begins, when the ethics of movement collapse into the politics of control, and it is art, not bodies, that takes on the task of traveling. In Palestine villages, embroidery once mapped belonging. Each region spoke in its own dialect of stitch, so you could tell where a dress was from simply by looking at it. You could tell who had made it, its colors, cuts, and motifs signaling lineage and life stage. The naqab thobe, for example, was dyed indigo and embroidered in desert hues, reflecting Bedouin ecology. The naqab Bedouin dress was expansive, it was geometric, it was practical, it had a slit in the front. In contrast, the Central Highlands preferred denser red silk embroidery on narrower cuts of black cotton. Bedouin garments were often cut from indigo or dark-dyed cotton and embroidered with geometric motifs which evoked ancient southern Palestinian designs. The naqab thobe thus carried a dual symbolism. Its hues and motifs signified tribal affiliation, while its expansive structured and traded materials reflected a life shaped by mobility, exchange, and adaptation. So women in the naqab embroidered their individual lives as much as they embroidered their land and their tribal affiliations. They practiced a kind of feminism that was somewhere between Western binaries of patriarchy and control and the constraints of the system that they lived within. Tatreez gave them a language, a personal expression, power, belonging. Then came 1948, the Nakba, the great unraveling. Villages emptied, families scattered, women fled carrying what they could, often a single embroidered dress or a chest of fabric. The thobe ceased to belong to a geography. It became geography itself. Each thread carried fragments of a lost village, and this is when it started to move and to speak for its people. What had been rural dress for many years before 1948 turned into a mobile relic, an archive of continuity amid catastrophe. In the aftermath of Palestinian displacement, embroidery traveled with its makers into the camps. Within tents and later concrete shelters, women stitched to live, transforming memory into livelihood. Styles mixed inside refugee camps, which crammed many Palestinians from different villages and embroidery styles together, and the camp dress emerged. It gave us an eloquent indication, again, on when the dress was made and where, from which chapter in the Palestinian story. This particular dress in the picture is very interesting in the way that it speaks to us about the harsh reality of a dress that was given or salvaged and then altered to fit its new owner, using cloth from a bag of flour, such as those distributed by the UN inside the refugee camps. Cooperatives like Inaash in Lebanon and Sulafa in Gaza organized collective production inside refugee camps, selling pieces abroad through aid networks. These workshops became spaces of social cohesion and endurance. They provided a livelihood for Palestinian women in times of economic need and gave them the power from within this destitution to make their own income, to feed their families, while quietly creating a testimony of nationhood, resisting with it the systemic erasure and appropriation that Palestinians in general and Palestinian women specifically were experiencing. Tatreez in exile was both income and inheritance, a quiet continuity amid collapse. It gave legitimacy to a homeland that was being disappeared. It acted as a living archive amid the erasure and the disappearance of land deeds and of maps. By the late 1960s, Tatreez acquired a new language of resistance. The PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, used it as its visual shorthand for Palestine itself. The woman in the embroidered dress became an icon of endurance. It became Mother as Nation, an icon of resistance to occupation. This is a significant moment in the story of feminist imagery within the Palestinian identity. Women were becoming an equal partner in the struggle against occupation, politically through the PLO and culturally through their handiwork. Tatreez found another venue for political expression some 20 years later. During the Intifada, a popular uprising that started in the late 80s, flags and maps were banned and women started stitching forbidden colors into their clothing. This was a new form of expression for women and for Tatreez. Resistance was now worn, not declared. Each dress became a manifesto, a wearable proclamation of return. And here, women were empowered to join the front lines of resistance, this time with the Intifada dress, traveling into new territory. This wealth of embroidery that was being produced in workshops and collected by diaspora Palestinians was slowly becoming a market unto itself. As decades passed, Palestinians in collecting vintage thobes were actively salvaging what war and displacement had scattered. As collections increased in number and in value, they started to be shared with cultural institutions globally and within the community itself for display. Here, Tatreez moved once more from camp to market and from suitcase to museum. Collecting preserved history even as it was reframing it. What was once everyday clothing became National Archive. It became domestic heirloom. It became exhibit pieces. In living rooms across the diaspora, framed embroidery and cushions became quiet curations of identity. Behind each cross lied a story, a village remembered, a mother's stitch, a home now imagined more than inhabited. When Tatreez dresses entered museum displays, their movement changed again. They carried the intimacy of touch into institutional spaces, challenging what museums choose to value and how they tell our stories. They exuded the energy that Sandra Dudley talks about for displaced objects in museums, where she claims that displaced objects speak for themselves, creating powerful encounters with viewers who suddenly feel their powerlessness and otherness in that gallery space. They also exist in a third space, one that Homi Bhabha shows us negotiates power and disturbs its balance. They form a new meaning, an alternative story that lies somewhere between that of the colonizer and the colonized. In this circulation, Tatreez shifts from the fabric of the fields to the fabric of remembrance, the geography of movement stitched into its very seams. In its continued movement, Tatreez preserves what borders strive to still. Its stitches remember, and they keep traveling. Yet every movement leaves ethical residue that we cannot and should not ignore. Aid organizations and global markets often sell Tatreez as the image of suffering. They turn resistance into product and they market sympathy. Scholars such as Dedman and Khurana remind us that humanitarian branding can aestheticize trauma while narrowing women's agency within a neoliberal consumer market. Women in refugee camp workshops are often severely underpaid for work sold at top dollar. The question here becomes, when does survival art turn into heritage commodity, and who controls that transformation? While these are valid and important questions that need to be addressed, one fact seems clear, that the Homo Viator, the nomad in this story, is not the Naqab Bedouin, but the Tatreez dress of every Palestinian woman that lived or lives before the Nakba and today. Across its journey, we have witnessed the Tatreez thobe become the emissary of the Palestinian culture. It moves through borders that confine its makers, from field to gallery, and from grief to survival. Examined through different frameworks, Tatreez emerges as an enduring living heritage, an ethical art of movement that resists erasure by circulating, by adapting, and by bearing witness. These stitches have outlived their villages, they have outlived their makers, they outlive their borders, and they remind us that art, too, can walk. This is where our journey ends today. While Tatreez continues its path beyond this room, it travels on the shoulder of women who stitch their stories into forever. Like Homo Viator, the eternal traveler, Tatreez journeys across land and memory, carrying home wherever it goes. Thank you.